Hello HEMA friends and welcome to this new video. Today I want to discuss the topic of martial and sport, but I want this time to find the truth behind it. The truth is that martial means complexity, while sports means standardization and simplification. So why I'm saying this? Well, actually because it is the truth. When you deal with manuals and you deal with a lot of sources, you find a ton of complex actions, a ton of techniques, etc., which are hard to contextualize, and in a certain sense it's a reverse engineering kind of job, which is not necessarily easy to do because you don't have a lot of hints in the greatest majority of the cases. And it requires a lot of efforts, critical thinking, etc., etc., to be done. It's a job hard to do, and it is complex. While instead, on the other side of the spectrum, there is a job which is hard to make again, but by a perspective of training especially. You need to put a lot of effort in your training, you need to be athletic, etc., etc. But at the same time, there is a simplification of actions, tactics, techniques, etc. by searching what works best and relating it with our modern context of application, which is different. And I already explained this in other videos. Now, what are the pros and cons of these two aspects of complexity versus simplifications and standardization? Well, let's find them out. Now, dealing with this kind of complexity of the HEMA environment means that working with order, it's harder. So finding out a way to read through a manual, it's not easy. Actually, it requires a lot of time and it's complex. So you can't work in a way which is linear in nature, in a sense that it is impossible to always find out the proper answer to the proper question that you have at a given time. Sometimes you complete this kind of picture as a puzzle. Funny enough. Now, because of this same motivation, complexity requires more time. You require a lot of time to make things work. And sometimes, if you want to compete, it is not worth the cost in time. Complexity requires critical thinking to a higher degree than simplification. And also, it requires you to have a certain degree of will in what you're doing. You have to believe that you're searching something that is meaningful, which generally speaking is the case, but you never know till you reach the point which you understood something, actually. Complexity may also be used as an excuse, like we are special, we are doing something that is better than others, and because of this, we actually don't have to put effort into it, funny enough. We don't have to train as much as the others. We don't have to be fit because technique is better than strength, blah, blah. So it can be used as an excuse, which is a huge problem of that side of the environment. Complexity may also develop kind of cult environments, in a sense that because you have to believe a lot in what you're doing to actually achieve your goal, it may result in some kind of cult, actually. You have to strongly believe that what you're doing makes sense, and you have to strongly believe that the teaching of that specific master or whatever are right. If you want to pursue the road which asks you a lot of time and sacrifices to be achieved and dealt with. Now, funny enough, if you deal with complexity in the correct way, which means that you are training a lot your physique, you're getting fit, you are training a lot your actions, you're training a lot your tactics, etc., etc. And you learn how to read through the manual in the meantime and place everything in the correct place. You have a lot of potential to develop, which means that the potential that you have while approaching complexity in the correct way, it's huge. Sometimes is even more than what you need to deal with the various fencing environments that we are facing nowadays. So it's an investment, but funny enough, it doesn't give you back everything that you put into it. At the same time, it is fascinating because you can find out a completely different way to conceptualize fencing, to build up your actions. And behind this layer, you may find different ways of approaching the opponent, different tactics, different techniques, different ideas. And the simple way that you're actually conceptualizing fencing in a different way, so that it means that it's a different language, let's say, so you learn a different language to speak. It also means that you are thinking in a different way, so you are finding out new ideas, and this is only thanks to approaching a manual in the correct way and finding out what it means. And luckily, as I mentioned it requires a lot of time, it requires more effort, funny enough, than what you would ever need to achieve the same results while approaching a more standardized and simplified version of training fencing, which means that it is not necessarily worth the cost. Plus, to approach this kind of path, I will say, you need to be extremely motivated. And that's why the greatest majority of people, which I found out, which approach HEMA in this kind of way, are kind of romantic. They find meaning behind fencing. They find meaning behind unlocking manuals, etc., which goes beyond the simple having fun while fencing. And that's why approaching manuals in a, I will say, serious way, sometimes, not every single time, but the greatest majority of the time, requires people to become kind of idealistic in nature. What about simplicity and standardization then? What are the pros and cons of this? Well, first of all, the most obvious pros, of course, is that it is simple. So it is rather simple to approach fencing by an intellectual, at least, perspective. So when you are thinking about your actions, your techniques, etc., it is rather simple to deal with this kind of problem compared to dealing with the complexity of what the manuals have to offer you. Then it works, but it also tends to the extreme. Now, if we had an extreme by an intellectual perspective when we were talking about complexity, in terms of simplification, simplifying our techniques, tactics, etc., we find an extreme by a perspective of landing actions. If we have lesser options in general, and between these lesser options we find the one which are best for that fencer, we have to make them the most extreme version of these options, because they have to adapt to a ton of other possibilities while fencing different opponents. And so every single action needs to be extremized as much as possible. It needs to be the fastest, the strongest, etc., etc. And that's when we get to standardization. That's what happens. That's the outcome of this process of extremizing things. It tends to create a meta, let's say, in which you find out always the best options against the other best options that are around in that specific given moment. And standardization gets also extremized. So till it is impossible to achieve the same results, let's say good results, with the tools that you have, you keep using them till they don't work anymore. And so even standardization gets extreme into this kind of environment. Now, one huge pros about standardization is that it comes easy to spread around. So if something is standard, it means that it is a standard in teaching, it is standard in practicing, in tools, equipment, etc., which means that it is easier to spread something around the globe. That's the huge pros of simplification and standardization. Now, a huge problem of standardization and simplification is that it brings you to a an extreme level of abstraction through time. So the more you standardize, the more you simplify, and the more you approach the various processes which I just mentioned, the more you abstract, in this case fencing or HEMA, from what it actually was, because of a series of other processes which are inside of the environment, like making tools a certain way which fits the most the practice that we approach nowadays for a variety of given reasons, but also approaching actions in a variety of given ways because of, for instance, refereeing, which may modify a lot the way in which you land your actions, depending from how the referee interprets the action itself. Now, if complexity has a huge potential which goes beyond even your necessities, and that's why it is so fascinating and peculiar, standardization have an outcome which is more in line with what you want to achieve. So it fits the context, it fits the box in which you are actually playing into. So you have the possibility to reach an outcome which is still impressive and huge, but still it is inside that specific box, which is tinier compared to the complexity of the various manuals. Now, compared to approaching complexity, which may be fascinating and makes you extremely interested into the practice because there are so much things to discover, standardization is different. Standardization is pragmatic, and you want to do the best thing for the best outcome. And sometimes, because of this same motivation, it may get frustrating. And frustration is a huge problem of simplicity and standardization, because, as I mentioned, it makes you extremize things a lot. And because you extremize things a lot, it means also that you get stressed. And it means that, in general, you may even not be satisfied by what you're doing, by an aesthetical perspective, by a practical perspective, whatever. It creates stress, and people tend to not be satisfied by what they are doing. They are not happy about their fencing. Because being pragmatic doesn't mean that you are actually doing something that you like. It means that you are doing something that you need. And here I want to sum up the two things. Now, one thing which I noticed on average is that when you have to approach complexity in the correct way, in the best way possible, you need far more qualities in general, and you need far more time, far more effort, etc., compared to, of course, and it's obvious even, approaching simplicity and standardization. If you approach these two environments with the same efforts, you basically improve far more in the standard environment, because it is easier to approach. It is built in such a way that it is easier to approach. If you approach complexity in the same way, you get far lesser. So you need to put a shit ton more efforts to obtain more or less the same results while approaching complexity. While standardization is a path which has already been planned to an extent, which means that you have to face lesser problems, which means that it is an easier path, which means that you are lesser options to develop your head in solving problems. And being a good problem solver is what actually a good fencer is. It's an extremely good problem solver. That's why I found out that complexity creates the best problem solvers and so the best fencers. And luckily, it is also an excuse for a lot of people. That's why as I already mentioned in another video, I am for a syncretic approach. I think that it is best to unite these two environments as much as possible, or better, to collaborate to create something. It is best to never divide, if possible, and to pursue the best possible approach to HEMA in all its aspects. Complexity is extremely important for us because it develops great minds, it develops great thinkers, and it may find out ways of applying fencing which are not even something that we may conceive right now. Because even if we, as humans, have the tendency of being always enlightened, and we think that we are best, and we find it also in the manuals, every single fencing master thought that they were the best. And luckily, it is not the case. We are still developing, we are learning, but especially we are forgetting things. We keep forgetting things through time. And rediscovering them is what complexity is all about. We can approach complexity and discover old ways of fencing, which for us are actually new, funny enough. On the other hand, we have standardization, which is useful to develop HEMA as a whole, to make it more widespread, and it is, thanks to standardization, more approachable by the crowd. And that's something that we may want to pursue at the same time, fun enough. And luckily, as you can imagine, these two environments are completely the opposite, and so putting them together is not easy. Actually, it may even be impossible. But I suspect that the best result will be keeping them as they are, as close as possible to each other, and move forward together. Very good, people. I hope you will find this video useful in some ways. Thanks for watching as always. Remember to check my Patreon, link in the description if you want to support me, the channel and my future projects. And as always, see you next time.